Last year I turned 25, got a little existential, and decided that life is way too short and beautiful to be spent behind a desk or not doing what you love. So I quit being a corporate girly, packed my bags, and started traveling the world. So after officially quitting our jobs, we packed our bags, loaded up the car, and headed to Alaska. The Alaska Highway, also known as the Alcan, is about a 1,300-mile highway that was originally built for the lower 48 states to connect to Alaska across Canada. We're averaging about 10 miles per day of driving time, so it will take us about a week to get to Alaska. I'm gonna be honest, we had driven through this Midwest area a bunch of times, and it's a lot of just flat, plain scenery, so we didn't take as many videos on the first 3 days. But the adventure really begins on day 4 when we get to Dawson Creek, which is mile 0 of the Alaska Highway. This is where the iconic world-famous Alaska Highway sign is located. From here, the highway starts to get pretty remote, and there might not be any fuel or food for hundreds of miles, so we stop at every gas station we can to fill up. It's cool to see the remote vibes of these random gas stations, and we even visited these pigs the gas station had in the back. Another popular location for people to stay at is Toad River at mile 422, which has gas, a restaurant, campgrounds, and this beautiful lake for wildlife spotting. We wanted to make it a little further, so we kept driving for about 40 minutes to reach Muncho Lake. We had finally reached the mountain scenery, and the lighting was beautiful at this time of day, so how could we not want to keep driving? We reached Muncho Lake with perfect timing right at sunset and unpacked at a nice little budget motel for the night. The next morning we got breakfast there, and I had the biggest piece of toast I've ever eaten. And then probably even better was we saw our first wildlife spotting and saw some dull sheep on the road. So probably drive carefully around Muncho Lake because you don't want to hit a sheep. And they're so cute. We even saw a baby one. Less than an hour later, we ran into some bison literally on the highway, so we had to stop, but I love watching bison and taking the time to watch them graze on grass. I think this herd seems to stay in this area because on our drive back on the Alaska Highway, we also saw them here. I could literally be entertained watching bison for hours, but we had a schedule to keep, so we kept going and then eventually crossed into the Yukon. Shortly after the Yukon border, another famous Alaska Highway landmark is the Signpost Forest. There's over 100,000 signs here from travelers, from homemade signs, license plates, street signs, and so much more. You can literally spend hours walking through this forest and reading them all. You could honestly put anything, even there's like a colander here. The visitor center has materials for you to make your own sign, which we actually did on our way home from Alaska. All you have to do is go to the hardware store across the street and buy a plank of wood, and then the visitor center provides you with the hammer, nails, and paint. It honestly was so hard to hammer the sign in, and maybe if you go, you'll find my sign. Back on the road again, we would be driving 4.5 hours through a bunch of scenic mountains, forests, and lakes to the town of Whitehorse. Whitehorse is the capital and the largest city of the Yukon. We wanted to get to Alaska as fast as possible, so we only stayed here for the night, but you could definitely stay here for longer. It's also a former gold rush town from the Klondike Gold Rush in the 1890s, and it's well known for the SS Klondike, which is a giant steamboat now turned museum on the Yukon River. I unfortunately only have these 3 pictures to show for the town because I wasn't in my peak travel blogging time yet, but we got a drink and some food at Yukon Brewing and walked around the town. Good morning on day 6, and we're actually going to be crossing into Alaska today. So, funny enough, we are actually leaving the Alaska Highway and changing to the Klondike Highway because we're going south to Skagway. Our first stop on day 6 is Emerald Lake, which is the most photographed lake in the Yukon. The sunlight reflects off the white calcium carbonate on the lake bottom, so there's really pretty bright green hues on the water and along the edges. I forgot to take videos at our next destination, but we got out to stretch our legs at the smallest desert in the world. The Carcross Desert is from the last ice age and surrounded by mountains and a cute spot to walk in the sand for a little bit. It's a popular spot for sandboarding, hiking, ATVs, snowmobiling, and toboggans. Hopefully all these videos of us driving on the highway with the mountains in the background isn't repetitive, but I'm keeping them in because it's the vibe and it's good memories. This is also where you'll start to see the train tracks for the White Pass and Yukon Railroad, which is also known as the Scenic Railway of the world. So here we stopped at Fraser Lookout and Summit Lake Lookout. As we get closer to the Alaska border, we start to see a difference in the terrain. This is specific to the area and it's called moonscape because it honestly looks as barren as the surface of the moon would. This subalpine terrain is a transition from vegetation of lower elevation trees to alpine vegetation above the tree line. So actually before we crossed the border into Alaska, we thought it'd be cool to cross the border on foot, which we're not doing anything illegal here. We're actually just doing a hike called International Falls. This was kind of like a choose your own adventure type of hike in terms of how long you wanted to go or how far you wanted to go. So we parked on the side of the highway at a rest area and climbed down this rope to get to the creek. from there, it's just stunning views of the mountains surrounding you, and you pass a bunch of waterfalls, and it was just the perfect way to start our journey into Alaska. We probably did about an hour hike, and then after that we got back into the car and drove into Alaska for the real thing. So once we passed border inspection, we were back in the US now. We had finally made it to Skagway, and if you imagine what a historic small town looks like during the peak gold rush era, Skagway is so well preserved that it basically looks like you're back in the 1890s. It's also a big cruise ship town because it's on the Inside Passage, so it's pretty crazy how busy it can get during the day, but then have no one but locals at night. So after Skagway, we went to Juneau and Glacier Bay, but I'm skipping to day 12 because that's just going to be a whole nother video, and I want to stay on the Alaska Highway. So it's a bit of a repeat because we're driving back on the Klondike Highway where we came from, and we're passing the same moonscape and deserts and everything, but we're going to Whitehorse and then past Whitehorse back onto the Alaska Highway. Now that we're back on the Alaska Highway, we started to see the Yukon Ranges, which has snow-peaked mountain views, and those are my favorite type of mountains. So then, as we got closer to Haines Junction, we started to see the St. Elias Mountains, which is part of the Kluane National Park and Reserve, and it actually includes some of the tallest peaks in Canada, like Mount Logan. If you wanted to see Kluane National Park for either some hiking or a flight seeing tour, you should definitely stay at Haines Junction. We had a long day of driving this day, so we didn't get to explore the park, but the next day, on day 13, we would spend time in Kluane. We started off the day visiting the cultural center and learning about the First Nations people and getting a lot of information about the park and trails. And then once we were finally in the park, I feel like it hit us with how drastic and tall these mountains were, and it was absolutely stunning. only real town you're going to pass is called Destruction Bay, which is on the west side of Kluane Lake. This would probably be the best place for you to stop for food, gas, or coffee, but I think this is actually where I got the best pictures of Kluane Lake, which is the largest lake in the Yukon. And how could we visit a national park and not hike? So we did a quick hike called Soldier Summit. And here is actually where they did the opening ceremony for the Alaska Highway. The hike isn't long, it's about 2-ish miles, and the elevation gain is about 800 feet, but it's really pretty views of Kluane Lake and the Alpine Meadow. After this, we're still making our way to the Alaska border, and before we cross the border, we reached the last town, which is called Beaver Creek. We stopped in the visitor center, and the people working there were so sweet and even gave us a little Yukon luggage tag. So 30 minutes after Beaver Creek, we passed the border again, and we're back into Alaska. Now that we're back in Alaska, it's a quick drive to Tok, which is the first major Alaska community when you're driving on the Alaska Highway, and it's where we're staying for the night. This is on the junction between the Alaska Highway and the Tok Cutoff, so you can either keep going south to Valdez, north to Fairbanks, or west to Anchorage, where we're going. I think day 14 is honestly the prettiest drive. Since we're going to Anchorage, we turned off the Alaska Highway, and now we're on the Glen Highway, which is part of Alaska Route 1 and a National Scenic Byway. Here's where Wrangell St. Elias National Park is, which is the largest national park in the United States, and unfortunately we didn't have time to go much past the visitor center, but even just driving through it was well worth it. The pictures I took here were some of my favorites, just with the mountains and the flowers and everything together was just amazing. Once we passed Glacier View, we started to see Matanuska Glacier flowing down from the Chugach Mountains. Matanuska is one of Alaska's most successful glaciers to see a glacier up close, and we would actually be hiking and climbing the glacier in a few weeks. It's the best way to see a glacier without taking an expensive flight or going to remote areas. After Matanuska Glacier, the last town we would drive through before we get to Anchorage is Palmer, but I didn't take any videos or anything because I knew we were going to go back there later. And then after a full week of driving, we'd finally made it to Anchorage. Here's our cute little furnished apartment. We luckily found a 1-month lease, which was perfect because all the Airbnbs and everything else were a lot more expensive. This truly was just the best home base for us because it was fully furnished, it had parking, it was a couple minutes walk downtown. I loved this place. So cheers to us to making it to our Alaska home. I'm so excited to spend the next 2 months here. If you've watched this far, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys later.